House Energy Committee will come to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Chair.
Here.
Representatives Howe.
Here.
Barrett.
Here.
Cole.
Here.
Tedder. Molino.
Here.
Farrington. Griffin.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
LaFave. Lauer.
Here.
Riley.
Here.
Lozinski.
Here.
Dianda.
Here.
Garrett. Camilleri. Elder. Green. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Need a motion to approve minutes from last week's meeting. Representative Houck so moves. Without objection, so ordered. Committee members, we actually have a bill before us today after all this preparation time. And the testimony we heard a couple of weeks ago when we heard from ITC and from LS Power will provide good background information. We'll hear a continuation of that today on a specific piece of legislation introduced by Representative Cole. And if you're prepared to do so, Representative, please take a seat front and center. Anybody else that wants that you want to join you? They want to come up with him? Okay. Okay, and it looks like we're going to have Doug Collins with Grid Alliance, Sharon Signer from ISP Transmission is going to join Representative Cole. And if you'll remember, committee members, we heard from these two witnesses just a couple of weeks ago. Representative Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and committee members. Appreciate it very much for the opportunity to present this legislation before you. It's actually two different bills this morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you again for the opportunity to introduce to you House Bill 4482 and House Bill 4483. Currently, state law prohibits qualified transmission companies from building new electric transmission lines within the state of Michigan. My bills will allow more competition on these capital-intensive projects to ensure the ratepayer is receiving the very best value for our investment in the grid. The legislation will allow for a transmission project that is deemed the most effective or cost-effective in the FERC jurisdictional regional transmission planning process to obtain a certificate of public convenience and necessity if and only if the Michigan Public Service Commission also finds it in the best interest of the state of Michigan. Today, the underlying statute, as passed in 2004, allows only an incumbent electric company to obtain a permit to construct transmission lines. Michigan will not be alone in its support of competitive pressures in this segment of the power industry. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, the Federal Trade Commission, Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission, Delaware Public Service Commission, New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, Ohio Consumers Council, West Virginia Consumers Advocate Council, California Public Utilities Commission, Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, Connecticut Department of Public Utility Control, and other key state commissions are all on record allowing competitive pressures in this segment of the power industry. I've got two individuals here that will introduce themselves to go into further detail and help answer questions on this package of bills, these two bills, and thank you again for allowing me to provide testimony on House Bill 4482 and House Bill 4483. Thank you, members of the committee and Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. And do either of the other of you want to offer testimony before we ask questions?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Sharon Segner, and I'm a Vice President at LS Power. As we introduced LS Power 2 weeks ago, LS Power is an independent power company with offices and assets throughout the United States, both on the generation and on the transmission side. LS Power strongly supports House Bill 4482 and House Bill 4483. Today, the Michigan Public Service Commission has the authority to issue a certificate of public need and necessity, convenience and necessity, which provides authority to construct high voltage transmission lines in Michigan. And the underlying statute that passed in 2004 allows affiliated transmission companies, an electric utility, or an independent transmission company to be issued a certificate of public convenience and necessity. And the Michigan Public Service Commission has full state authority to deny or approve a CPCN for the siting of that line. Today, an independent transmission company or an affiliated transmission company has the power to condemn property that is necessary to transmit electric energy for public use, subject to both the Electric Transmission Line Certification Act and the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act. Under current law, this is the problem. The laws of the definitions of affiliated transmission companies and independent transmission companies are very narrow, and they revolve around being engaged in the state of transmission of electricity when assets are owned on or around in the state on December 31st, year 2000. And that in of itself creates the barrier to entry. And so the current need for these bills, though, arises from some changes that have occurred at the national energy policy level. Since this bill was written, the underlying statute was written 15 years ago. The national changes were issued in a FERC decision called FERC Order 1000, and it was upheld by a bipartisan panel before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia in August of 2014. FERC Order 1000, among other things, allows competitive pressures to enter the world of FERC jurisdictional electric transmission. Prior to this, utilities held a right of first refusal for any new transmission facilities. And so as a result of the changes that have occurred at the national level and competition pressures, the underlying statutes in the Michigan statutes need to be updated to reflect the current market realities. As a result of FERC Order 1000, when regional transmission projects are planned and paid for by two or more utilities, there is generally a competitive process for regional transmission projects. Once the most effective or cost-effective project in the FERC jurisdictional project regional planning process occurs, the winning developer will then move on to the state siting process. We support this bill because it would allow regional transmission projects that are deemed the most effective or cost effective in the FERC jurisdictional regional transmission planning process to obtain a construction permit in the state of Michigan. However, it should be noted that this would only occur if and only if the Michigan Public Service Commission also finds it in the best interest of the state of Michigan. The bills update current law with the new market realities, and it modifies the definition of independent transmission company and allows new competitive entrants proposing to engage in the transmission of electricity in the state to apply and be granted a certificate of public need and necessity, if and only if the Michigan Public Service Commission agrees. And similar to most states, the bills allow for condemnation powers to an entity that holds the certificate issued by the Michigan Public Service Commission if that entity is not an affiliate of an electric utility generating to retail customer or transmitting to retail customers in the state. The Michigan Public Service Commission retains complete power to grant or deny a permit to any party, and full Michigan state control remains over the siting of transmission. We appreciate the opportunity to provide comments.
Thank you, Ms. Segner. Mr. Collins, did you wish to offer testimony?
I'll keep my comments very brief. Ms. Segner did a very good job of explaining the need for these bills. My name is Doug Collins. I'm a VP at Grid Alliance, as well as president of the Transco, which operates in the northern MISO region. We also strongly support these bills. We believe in competition, and as we demonstrated when we were here before you the last time, competition in transmission has lowered the cost of transmission facilities. With that, I'll close. And any questions?
Mr. Collins, it's been a long 2 weeks. Could you remind us about, I remember generally, but if you would remind us specifically as to the dollar amounts, as I recall, they were fairly significant.
I don't have the dollar amounts in front of me, but typically the savings were 20 to 30% off of the estimated costs that the RTOs put forward. And they set those estimated amounts based upon historic costs in their regions.
Okay, Representative Barrett has a question.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for being here. I'm kind of trying to wade through this a little bit. I know we've got FERC and MISO and then our state, like Public Service Commission and everything, kind of all having their fingers in this. What I was curious about is with MISO right now, a vast majority of their projects are not subject to competitive bidding. Is that correct? That most are kind of outside of the scope of what would be competitively bid if it were a MISO approved project. And so I guess my question is, which projects, if we enacted this policy, how much, like what percent of what would be bid out, say in the next decade, would be competitively bid at that point?
If I may, basically in the way that competition policy works at a national level is that essentially when regional transmission projects that are approved by either MISO or PJM, when the regional transmission projects are paid for by two or more utilities, there are competitive pressures that go into play relating to those transmission projects in general.
Okay, so if consumers and DTE were both running like transmission, is that what you're saying?
If there are two or more
transmission utilities.
Transmission utilities. And so in MISO today, there are a limited number of projects that are going out for bid because right now there are the essentially two or more utilities are not, because of how they have their cost rules, two or more utilities are not necessarily paying for the full cost of those transmission lines. And so you have a limited pool in MISO. On the PJM side of Michigan, you have a fair number of projects that are out for competitive bid. These, in terms of what goes out for bid and what doesn't go out for bid, that's going to evolve and change as time goes on. What's important is for the policy to be set where if a project does go out for bid, there is a potential for those projects to have approval, for the necessary approvals from the state.
Okay. And then I know that kind of that use of eminent domain is kind of a last resort, is my understanding, if at all possible. We try and work with, I assume we try and work with property owners to avoid that necessity to I guess, take their property or have an easement or whatever the case is. Do you do that already in other states? Do you try and avoid the eminent domain where possible and work with the property owner and everything to avoid that, I guess, adversarial position?
From an LS Power standpoint, absolutely, yes. And certainly LS Power, we have transmission projects in other parts of the country as well. And we have a very good track record with the landowners. And first of all, working with the landowners, and eminent domain is a last resort item. Okay. What is suggested in terms of in this bill concept is essentially tying the use of eminent domain to the existence of a certificate of public need and necessity. And that is consistent with the policy of most states in the country, that in order to be able to use the eminent domain authority, there needs to be the certificate that's been issued by the State Commission.
Okay. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just to continue that, I've been involved with transmission and electric utility business for over 30 years. And, you know, of the many lines that have been built in that time frame in the companies that I've worked for, I can probably count on one hand the number of times that eminent domain was actually used. Eminent domain, although it has a very frightening effect, typically what it's really used for is to get the landowner at the table to negotiate. They know what their land is worth, and it's a backstop. Sure. It allows, you know, true negotiation power from both sides, and it's really a way that we can balance the needs between cost to the customer and landowner rights and and needs.
Sure. And I think eminent domain is, is necessary in certain circumstances and whatnot, but of course we want to make sure that it's contained appropriately as well. But, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Segner?
I also might add that, just to clarify, to be very, very clear, eminent domain is not a taking without compensation. And so in the context of this, there's compensation
Right.
involved. And I would also mention that the bill language in this particular bill is very clear that independent transmission companies and affiliated transmission companies basically are subject to the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act in effect in Michigan today.
Right. They wouldn't be treated any differently than another provider doing that same.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
And Representative Cole, that's kind of the point of the bill, isn't it, to increase the number of people who fall under the exact same rules and regs?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair.
And in any given project, there's only going to be one entity, the one that gets both MISO approval and wins the bid, that's going to exercise eminent domain authority if it's needed. Just one.
Correct.
Okay. Vice Chair Lisinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, looking at this bill, I have a lot of concerns around the expansion of eminent domain and why. So, I'd like to explore a little bit the decision to expand it prior to a project. So when we're looking at projects that come before, I have a couple questions along that. Are there projects that we see in the future that we're getting ready for that we know that we have the need to competitively build right now?
One of the projects that is potentially out there would be to connect the peninsulas, something that is done just in a very non-substantial form at this time. And so it's commonly referred to last session as One Michigan and connecting the peninsulas to encourage economic development in both the upper and lower peninsulas and allow electrons to freely flow between the peninsulas.
Okay, thank you. And Sharon, I apologize, I'm calling you by your first name, but that's the name I remember off the top of my head. How many projects has LS Power competed for, won, and completed?
LS Power, in terms of our transmission, since Order 1000 came into effect about 5 years ago, LS Power has successfully competed for projects in PJM, MISO, and California. And so we have won projects in the PJM region and MISO and California. And part of the reason that LS Power, we believe that we've been successful in winning some of these projects is that we have proposed very innovative structures related to cost containment for the project. And one thing that is good that's happened since Order 1000 has come into effect is that it's basically said that competitors have basically said, let's sharpen our pencil on what the cost of these transmission projects is, and it is changing the risk structure of these transmission projects. Instead of the ratepayers bearing all the risk, it's shifting risk from the ratepayers to the developers. And so LS Power has right now has won more projects than most in terms of for these competitive transmission projects because of the type of rate structure. These projects are under development right now because of the timing of when these bids happened. But we've been awarded the projects and they're going through the siting process. And in addition, LS Power is a public utility today in the state of Texas. And we have we have a control center and operate those projects. And then we also have a transmission project in the state of Nevada.
So you haven't completed a project or exercised eminent domain in any of the projects you've successfully won?
No, I didn't say that.
That's why I'm asking.
In terms of the projects that we've won, we have not exercised eminent domain for those projects. Okay. In the state of Texas, there was an exercise of eminent domain on some parts of that project. Although, in terms of in the CPCN process, the landowners, it was one of the most successful sightings that has happened in West Texas.
Okay. So when we're looking at this bill and looking at the expansion of eminent domain rights to a person, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity, or its successors or assigns. You are currently owned by a hedge fund, correct?
No, that is not correct.
Who are you owned?
We are owned by Blackstone, which is a private equity firm.
A private equity firm. So,
That would be similar to KKR, which owned ITC when it started up.
okay. So when we look at this legislation, if we were to pass it as written, if your private equity firm, do the rights assign to the private equity firm that owns you?
I believe the only one that would have the eminent domain right would be Grid Alliance or its Transco, because we would be the one that holds the CPCN.
But you're owned by a private equity firm who has the right to sell you or assign the rights to you to someone else? And the rights for eminent domain would transfer with that?
The rights would remain with the company, not with the purchaser.
So we start to get into a bit of a gray area there for me, understanding corporate structures and how ownership and blended ownership and partnership and ownership by equity firms or different funds of companies. And so just that makes me an uncomfortable part of the legislation for me is corporate structure and who the eminent domain rights attached to can be transferred to or assigned to.
I would just be very, very clear that the proposed bill language as it's written mirrors the exact language that applies to both independent transmission companies and affiliated transmission companies today. It's mirrored exactly like that. So for instance, ITC and affiliated transmission companies, their language for that today reads exactly the same. It says a person, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity or its successors or assigns. And so basically the language mirrors the exact language that's in law today. But what's different, though, for the new entrant is it says that same language, a person, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity or its successor or assigns that holds a certificate issued by the Commission under the Electric Transmission Line Certification Act if that entity is not an affiliate of an electric utility generating or distributing electricity to retail customers in the state. So it's actually very specifically, it's the entity that holds the certificate that has the eminent domain.
Yes, and you brought in front of us 2 weeks ago a list of about 60 companies that were approved by MISO to be, and so we would be expanding the eminent domain rights to those 60 companies?
No.
Why not?
The reason is because those 60 companies are companies that are qualified to compete at MISO and to be competing in the process. One of those 60 companies would have to have a certificate of a certificate issued by the Michigan Public Service Commission in order to have eminent domain. It's possible that one of those companies might get a certificate, apply for a certificate from the Michigan Commission under this legislation, but it's only the entity that has the certificate in hand from the Michigan Public Service Commission.
But I thought you stated
but
2 weeks ago that you couldn't get that certificate unless you had this legislation.
That's correct. There's two bills. So basically, House Bill 4483 addresses the ability to be granted
So
a
if we
certificate.
pass these two bills, all 60 of those companies would have the ability to exercise eminent domain.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so this is where we're going in circles, and this is where we went in
We're
circles
going
last.
if you pass this bill, those 60 companies have the ability to apply for a certificate. If you pass the bill, only the company that holds a certificate from the Michigan Public Service Commission has the power of eminent domain.
Representative Cole, I'll ask again, since it seems relevant, the same question I asked 10 minutes ago. Under these two bills, if passed, there'll only be one entity exercising eminent domain, correct? That's the one that wins the approval process from MISO and then wins the process from the Public Service Commission here in Michigan.
Yes, pardon me. That is correct, and it goes through all of the criteria which was stated previously by the two individuals here. That is cleared by the state and qualified to do that.
And who has the eminent domain authority? That's what's in current law. Is that correct?
Yes, today who has the eminent domain authority is an affiliated transmission company or an independent transmission company, which is basically ITC.
So the purpose, as I understand the legislation, is simply to open up to competition by increasing the number of entities that are able to successfully win from the Public Service Commission a certificate of construction, but only if they're approved by MISO before that. But otherwise, the rules apply exactly the same to everybody.
This is opening competition.
It's just no longer limited only to entities that held property in Michigan as of December 31st, 2000.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Representative Dianda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. I guess my question would be to the bills. If we have a situation now where there's an easement and you're going to look for a new crossing for eminent domain, you know, I can't speak for that district, but it's close to ours in the UP. That's some of the oldest property that we have that's been deeded on that territory in that Straits area. So you would be looking at another crossing section somewhere for a project. Is that correct?
The potential is there that could be the case. Depends on, there's a lot of information that would come out and the siting requirements and what made the most sense.
And I guess for a project of that scope, what would be the amount of property needed for a crossing to have the same ability to what we have now for an easement that's going across? Size-wise.
That's correct.
Size-wise, can you give me an example of how much property you'd need for that crossing?
It really depends on the size of the transmission line because that drives the width of the right-of-way, but it's not uncommon for 120 feet.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I guess my next question would be, would you explain to me the projects that you have that are underdeveloped, or are you looking at developing in other parts of the country? And what is the need and the scope where you're putting these systems in? Are you looking at solar farms where you're expanding the transmission? Are these states that are high in population increases in the industry? Could you give me an example of what you're looking at and where you're doing this currently?
Sure. A couple examples. For instance, LS Power won a project in MISO. It was their first Order 1000 competitive bid process. The project is in the state of Indiana and part of Kentucky. And it is called a market efficiency project. And market efficiency projects are transmission projects that are put in place to lessen the economic congestion on the transmission grid, and which helps lower energy prices. And so LS Power won a project in the state of Indiana, and it's partly in Kentucky as well, and won that project. And so it was addressing economic and addressing energy prices and helping projects that essentially help to lower energy projects. In the state of Delaware, and New Jersey, where LS Power won another Order 1000 project, there is a stability issue going on at the second largest nuclear facility in the country, and that the purpose of that project is to enhance system reliability and some of the stability issues related to the nuclear facility. In the state of Colorado, the state of California, some of the projects related are related to renewable growth. But it really depends. My company has been involved in developing projects that are reliability driven, that are also driven for market efficiency purposes, as well as public policy needs.
Just if I can, Mr. Chairman, one quick question.
Yes, sir.
Do you see the future with more generation, or are you going to see expanded distributing of energy? Are you going to see more generation in these other states that you're servicing now? Do you see more generation locally, or are you seeing longer transmission of distribution? Because I guess this is my question for the need of the legislation. If we're going to be looking at generating more power in the UP and the northern lower, you talked about trying to put the two peninsulas together, is this something that's going to be more feasible for us to be able to generate the power on the two peninsulas rather than do the transmission? And the cost analysis of that is always the question. And who's going to pay for this? This is my final question of cost of project and how we're going to share that burden, that expense.
My belief is that competitive transmission and allowing competitive transmission pressures is good for consumers. And so by allowing and having state policies that allow a vibrant marketplace is good for consumers. And so critical infrastructure projects such as you suggest here this legislation is a good foundation because it essentially allows a clear foundation for many potential competitors to be involved in competing for those solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Dianda. Representative Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was answered.
Okay, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to clarify, do these bills give you any more power or authority that ITC or ATC currently have, or does it merely give you the same authority that they currently have?
It is the same or potentially less with that, so thank you.
That's it. Representative Elder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming to testify this morning. So if I understand correctly, you're in the process of building the projects that you have been awarded. Is that correct? You've not yet built anything, but you plan to. They've been awarded, and you're starting to site the projects. Is that right?
No, that's not correct. LS Power has won 3 Order 1000 projects, one in PJM, one in MISO, and one in California. But prior to that, and those are under development right now, we've been awarded and they're under development. But prior to that, LS Power has built and constructed, and they're in operation today, several hundred miles of 345 kV lines in the state of Texas, where we're a public utility, as well as several hundred miles of 500 kV lines in the state of Nevada. And those facilities are operational today.
Okay. And so my question was, in those other projects, and it might be geographically based, what your answer is, what percentage of that work is done by organized labor?
I'm honestly not sure what the answer to that question is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Elder. Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on the eminent domain. That would only be based on a per project basis, correct? So you would only get the eminent domain rights for that particular project, not a wholesale ability to, go out and condemn property, or if you were purchased by the Chinese or something like that and started condemning property around Michigan, you would only have it on a right-of-way basis connecting that transmission line, right?
Yes, the language that's in House Bill 4482 that I'm pointing to, that would be our authority, would be the line that says, a person, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity or its successor or assigns that holds a certificate issued by the Commission under the Electric Transmission Line Certification Act, if that entity is not an affiliate of an electric utility generating or distributing electricity to retail customers in this state.
And that would be per that project, correct? That would be connecting transmission for that particular purpose?
Yes. So
Okay.
you would help, so essentially House Bill 4483 provides the ability to obtain a certificate, and then House Bill 4482 provides the eminent domain authority consistent with that certificate.
Thank you.
Representative Cole, referencing the language that says the only people who can actually get a certificate of construction are those who held holdings as of December 31st, 2000. Do you know how many entities meet the definition of the law and can actually construct in Michigan today because they were in business as of December 31st, 2000?
It's just a couple of entities right now and several that are affiliated at this point in time, so this would broaden that to allow more competition to protect ratepayers.
Just a couple. And the list that was provided, as Vice Chair Lisinski referenced a few minutes ago, that you provided us 2 weeks ago, was some 60 entities that would meet MISO's approval. Is that correct? Anyway, dozens. So we have 2 representatives today, LS Power and Grid Alliance, but we could have 58 others who are in the same position. The point simply being, well, let me not put words in your mouth, Representative Cole. What's your best edit? We've got 2 members of the committee who just walked in having heard none of the testimony. This seems to me to be a pretty simple bill. What is the intent of the bill in removing that date at which, if you weren't in business as of that date, you can't do business in the state of Michigan?
Correct. This is to broaden who can apply for this and who can potentially compete to build transmission in the state of Michigan, thereby keeping rates low as competition has that effect on entities that are being built.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Cole. Any other questions, committee members? Thank you, Representative Cole. And other witnesses, I would note that we have...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee.
Thank you, Representative. We have Tony Dott with the Michigan Freedom Fund, who does not wish to speak, but who supports the legislation. And we also have John Garvin of ATC, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that's who does transmission projects in the UP. That's correct? Okay. And they are in favor of the legislation, but do not wish to speak. We also have Randy Gross with ITC, and he does wish to speak. So Randy, please come forward. Anybody else you need to bring with you, and we look forward.
I'll wing it.
Okay. Thank you. Please proceed.
Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you for the time. I had a quite lengthy testimony prepared, and I realize I don't like to talk that much, so I think I will try and shorten it and let questions drive a lot of my responses here. But I think it's important to focus in on a couple pieces here, because what I heard at the table here just testifying, I think, is not exactly what the bills do, and that's our concern. Let's dispel this first myth about competition and us. We don't have a problem with competition in this sector. We believe there is competition in this sector. We believe that if there was hypothetically ever a project that came up in Michigan that qualified for competitive bidding, that it would be bid by MISO. If an entity won it that was not currently in Michigan, they would have the ability to build that project. Would they have eminent domain rights under current law? No, we concede that point. Would they get a siting certificate, which you've heard talked about? Can they get that right now? No, we concede that point. But let's talk about a couple of those issues there. I'm going to start on the siting certificate piece. This has been focused in on a lot. The assumption is that you need to have a siting certificate to build a transmission project. I think that's at least how it's been moving forward. You only need a siting certificate for very specific projects. It's projects that are over 345 kV, which are large lines, and over 7 miles, both. I mean, those are the qualifiers to do this. So if you have a project...
Sorry, can you repeat those, please?
Sure. 345 kV, it's 345,000 kilovolts, and 7 miles in length. That's in the statute as if a project is over this, you must come into the commission and get a siting certificate. Anything outside of that, if it's 200 miles long, but it's 200 kV, you don't have to go to the commission. You're not required to go to the commission and get a certificate. So in fact, the siting certificate has been used 5, maybe 6 times in history to build transmission in Michigan. So I'm not saying it's never been used. I'm just saying it's the anomaly in the process. It's not the standard. So again, if there was some hypothetical competitive project that was 200 kV and 150 miles long, and it was put up for bid in MISO, and pick your developer wins that project, pick your company wins that project, they could come in and they don't need to go get a siting certificate. They're not required to by law. Point 1. Point 2, eminent domain. It's absolutely a backstop. I'm not going to disagree with what Mr. Collins said on that. It's been used in the past. It is an absolute last resort. I will tell you, and I will echo what he said, that the majority of transmission projects, not only in this state, but in the country, and we're talking like high 90%, never get to eminent domain. I mean, it's not a good thing to use. We don't want to use that. So to be clear, I do want to point out that you could build a project here without either of those and without even having to go to the commission to get a certificate. So let's talk about if there's a hypothetical, project that goes over that. Is there some perceived project that could be developed that would be prohibited from an outside entity building? And my answer is yes. I mean, you're right. There is a model I can build where an outside entity would not be able to build that project. A company who does not have eminent domain rights or the ability to go get an Act 30 right. That doesn't mean it still wouldn't be a competitive project, by the way. It's been billed that ITC, and I would love if this were true, is the only transmission company in the state. Or that we're one of two, and that ATC is the only other transmission company in the state. There are at least 9 qualified transmission companies that are currently located in this state that could build, all of which have all the rights that are currently in law. They can get an Act 30. They can get a siting certificate. They can do all of that. So even if you go to the extreme and believe that there is some type of barrier to entry, you still have at least 9 qualified entities that could build in some form, and that's not even broaching the subject on what if they wanted to partner with somebody. I mean, this happens all the time. I mean, we've partnered with entities in Kansas to build projects with the local utilities. LS Power has shown a successful model in partnering. I believe they partnered with a co-op to build their project down in Indiana. So I mean, this is a model that can happen. So it's still not even really a preclusion of bringing them in. Now, what I heard during testimony is that these projects are really geared at those competitive MISO projects. And I would push back that right now that the language is narrow enough on that. If that's really what the goal is, I think there's a path to solve that problem of a hypothetical project that may sometime be competitively bid in Michigan that exceeds all the thresholds that are currently in law and would require some type of siting certificate. So if that's what we're trying to get at, I think there's a way to get there without completely decimating the Eminent Domain Act, because I do think the way it's drafted right now has bigger consequences than what people are realizing. And there's nowhere in this, in either the Act 30 bill, which I think is 4482, that qualifies this. It says if you have that it's a competitively bid project from MISO that you come in there. It just says that if you are engaging in building in the amendment or proposes to engage in building, that's nothing to do with obtaining a competitively bid project. So we think it's broader than what's being discussed, and if the focus is to try and narrow this down to those handful of projects that may ultimately at some point, potentially in the next decade, fit in there, I think that's a discussion we can have, and we're okay with that. But the way it's drafted right now, we think it's just opening up the eminent domain statute too much. There's too much potential. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying any of the entities that have been here before you, Mr. Chair, are these entities, but if you have an entity come into the state and they're a bad actor with eminent domain, it's the rest of the utility sector that pays for it. And just like you guys have associated that any transmission in the state is ITC, if it's a transmission company that comes in and does something wrong with eminent domain, it's ITC that catches all the heat for it. And this has already happened in Iowa, where you've had developers come in and been bad actors with eminent domain. This has happened in Arkansas, where developers have come in and been bad actors with eminent domain, and it's had some pretty severe consequences. And those are the type of situations we're trying to protect against. It's not the competitive piece. It's those situations. And I'm going to make one last point, and then I'll take all questions, Mr. Chair. And this is to your date certain in the Act. I think it's important to talk about that piece. The reason that date is in there is that was kind of the last vestige of implementing what you've called, Mr. Chair, the John Engler energy model. So the 2000 rewrite, part of that was to divest transmission, join an RTO. That's what they told the utilities to do. It was either or. And the utilities chose to do both. They chose to join an RTO, and then they chose at some point to divest their transmission. It wasn't that they divested day one of January 1 of 2000. I mean, there was a process. It was, I mean, they had to spin off a full, a third of their company, essentially. So there was a process in developing that. As I went through that process, they discussed this, and the issues were we wanted to maintain status quo, and I say we, I will tell you, I'll fully confess, I was on staff at that time working on these issues. Chairman Bradstreet was the sponsors of these bills at the time, and the idea was we want to maintain status quo without blowing up eminent domain. So the date certain was picked not because it was some magic number that ITC had assets in 2000. The date certain was picked because it was the magic number of this is what the entities looked like in Michigan and what the eminent domain rights and PA 30 rights were in Michigan at that time. And they wanted to just carry forward status quo on what those rights were. Order 1000 wasn't in play. These competitive concepts weren't in play. So is it the most artfully drafted definition? Probably not. Sometimes definitions at state level and congressional level aren't artfully drafted, unfortunately. I mean, there are a lot of terms and regulations as to what an independent transmission company is now at the federal level. But I want to make sure this wasn't a protectionist move. This was the implementation of the John Engler model to divest transmission, but maintain that status quo at the state level. Again, if your goal is to address these competitive projects that may at some point be bid that we don't think would be able to come in, I think there's a way to do that without going into this definition, and you may want to look at other terms and use more of a scalpel approach as opposed to the sword approach in fixing this legislation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I would be happy to take as many questions as you want to have come at me.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. Whatever the intent of the language 17 years ago, is the effect of it today protectionist, since it limits the number of people who can participate at least in those high-end projects that you outlined, the 300,000 kV and 7 miles?
Yeah, fair question. I guess my answer will be no more protectionist than the definition of what utility is, no more protectionist than what the definition of co-op or municipal electric is. I mean, all those entities can participate in the same things we can.
Right.
I mean, they're not precluded from doing anything that we're precluded from doing. So, I mean, that's my point, though. If you're trying to fix a specific issue, I mean, we've heard that MISO and appellate courts and Supreme Court has actually ruled in a little bit on this, and FERC have all kind of defined what this competitive world is. Well, our concern is the bill's a little broader than that, and it presents some ambiguity as to what the rights are. If we really want to narrow this down, I mean, maybe it's, you don't need to redefine independent transmission or affiliated transmission. You can define a new sector and build what those rights are and be more direct and focus as to what you're trying to achieve with that goal.
Is that date certain language 17 years later necessary? Does it fulfill a function now in 2017?
I think if you eliminate it, it doesn't have the effect of being as targeted as what I'm hearing up here as being the goal. And that would be our point, is if we were going to redefine independent transmission company, I think we would want to go out and look at now what the federal definition is and mirror that federal definition and be restrictive in that sense. So, I mean, we think there's value in it. I mean, maybe there's not. Maybe it's more of a nostalgic approach from our thing, and I'll say protectionist, and that's how we've always been defined, different than utilities here. I mean, I don't have a great answer for you that, Mr. Chair. I mean, what I would say is if your goal is to target the competitive process, I think the approach here on eliminating a date certain, it has a broader impact than just affecting those targeted pieces.
You said that this legislation would decimate the Eminent Domain Act. Can you outline for the committee under this legislation, if it became law, how exactly someone would get the authority to exercise eminent domain?
Sure.
Under the bill.
They can be in, so your PA 30 is 4483. And if you look under definition of independent, the new language is that fully satisfies the requirements to join an RTO. Okay, I pay my $15,000 to be a developer. I'm fully part of an RTO now. And that I'm proposing to engage in a project. Now I can get an Act 30 and go get a eminent domain. I don't have a project. I don't have an approved project. I have a planning department that proposes a project. Doesn't mean it's a project MISO's approved, doesn't mean it's a project that's been competitively bid, doesn't mean it's a project, quite frankly, that the commission's approved at that point. We're saying they have the right to go get an Act 30, and it can be, you know, Randy Gross transmission, and I have some good idea to put some lines on a paper, and I don't know if they work.
We've heard testimony from the sponsor of the legislation that his intent is that the eminent domain apply just as it do to you, exactly as it does to ITC, only in the circumstance in which they have actually won the MISO process and get a certificate to construct. So if the language is clarified to make it clear that satisfies you as to the intent of the sponsor, we know what the sponsor says the intent is. If the language is changed in some way to make it clear that it's not, as you just described, somebody who simply says, I got an idea for a transmission project, therefore I have eminent domain. I know that's not the intent of the sponsor. So if the language is changed in such a way as to make it clear it's what he intends it to be, are you then opposed to the bill still, or at that point?
No, I think that's something we can have a discussion with, and we'd be happy to help work on the language. Again, we want to make sure the language doesn't have unintended consequences, because whether you agree with this or not, if somebody's a bad actor with eminent domain, it does reflect on us, and will have impact on our industry and our business.
Right.
So it's not the pure. I know people keep wanting to say this is because we're afraid of competition. Look, we go with LS Power. You heard this. Simon talked about this last week. We've testified with them in similar situations. I mean, there are opportunities to fix this, and we'd be happy to sit down and help work through that process. And it was refreshing for me today to hear that that's the intent, because again, when I'm reading the legislation that's before me, and I've seen no other language in the two bills that have been introduced and had no conversations, that may be the intent, but you know, a court doesn't care what the intent is, Mr. Chair. The court cares about what the letter of the law is. And we don't think the letter of the law here is very clear as to that intent.
And under Michigan law, or even under these bills if passed, if you get eminent domain authority once for a project, do you still have it thereafter perpetually, or is it limited only to the project you've won? So
I'll answer it, I guess, in twofold. And I'll verify at some point that I'm not lying to you, but I'm fairly confident I'm accurate on this. So in the case of entities right now, let's talk about your utilities, your cooperatives, your Wolverines, your ITC, your ATCs type entities that are out there. They are defined terms and entities that have eminent domain rights. They have assets in the state. They've been viewed as a, I'm going to use this term loosely because it's a defined term, but public utility. Waterways, railroads, things along those lines. So they do have some eminent domain. It's not on a per project aspect. What I think I heard is the goal is from like a competitive bid process would be to identify a process where if you won that bid, you would get it on that project going forward, and it wouldn't be retained with that entity who won it, you know, that outside entity that won the bid in perpetuity. I don't think that's what these do, and the reason I would point you to that is if you go to the eminent domain statute, and the section actually that was referenced by, I don't remember if it was LS Power or Good Lines, but the new section on page 4, the sub 2, where it talks about you have to have a PA 30 to have it. All it says is that if you hold an Act 30, you now have eminent domain rights. It doesn't say eminent domain rights for the project that you were awarded under Act 30 or anything along those lines. So again, if those are the concepts and the goal of the legislation, we're happy to sit down and work through that and make sure the language is crafted in an appropriate manner to achieve that goal. We just don't think, as drafted, these bills will get there.
The reason I ask the question is I've heard expressions from people on both sides, both for and against this legislation, that they would be interested in a separate piece of legislation that might expressly limit everybody's eminent domain authority to a project-by-project basis and not just be given carte blanche because you happen to be in business on December 31st, 2000.
But not December 31st, 2000. It's anybody that's identified in the Eminent Domain Act. I mean, there's a structured act for it.
Representative Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Although I think, you know, in concept, we can all agree that competition is a good thing. As I'm listening to your testimony, several questions are coming to my mind, and I think I share your concern, and also the chair's concern that although we're talking about competition, we're also talking about something else that is extremely important, that is basically private property rights. So I guess I'd like to encourage the committee to keep talking and to ask some questions that specifically deal with, and here's what made me raise my hand with the question today. You know, the concern is that the devil's in the details, and on the heels of a big energy package passing last session, and I understand that we're dealing with transmission, that perhaps these two things, you know, one isn't going to influence the other directly, but as a new committee member, before we start moving a new package, I want to know that, you know, have we covered all this? If this bill passes, is it going to create more of a problem later that we're going to have to deal with? And so we have a lot of terms that are floating around and a lot of definitions, and I just appreciate a little more time to make sure that that this discussion isn't going to undo something that happened before. And so I welcome, I guess I'm asking for a little more time to clarify that, and maybe just to talk with the bill sponsor too a little more on that. So.
Representative Griffin, we do not intend to vote today on the legislation. Representative LaFave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony today. I guess I just kind of have a clarifying question. Is it your testimony today that all I need to be is an independent transmission company established by 2000 or 1999, and I can just use eminent domain to demolish some guy's house I don't like and take his property?
Well, no,
or
it's
do
not
I need
quite
to
that.
do I need to actually put a transmission line in or have some real purpose to do that?
Right, there are some requirements around us on when we can use eminent domain. I mean, and it's set out both in the current act. I mean, we have the definitional section of that, of what is it, 486. If you go in there, there's a whole section as to what you have the rights to do for, you know, the public good, public use. I mean, there's identified things along that lines in that aspect. And then there's also there's a whole statute that regulates condemnation procedures, which is referenced in here. So it's not just simply we can go in and demolish somebody's house and along those lines.
Okay,
I mean,
well, that's good. Okay. And then a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
But to be clear, let's not just reference this date. I mean, it's any entity that has eminent domain rights. They all have the same rights, okay? I mean, this is no different. You know, the approach that's being taken here would be no different if you wanted to redefine, you know, a cooperative and say, hey, if you're an independent power producer, you are also a cooperative. I mean, this is kind of the change that's being done, and that's what we're saying. We need to be more artful in what we're defining, and let's figure out what we're defining.
Say that again?
This would be no different than if you wanted to redefine the definition of cooperative or utility or municipal electric and roll in outside power producers. I mean, it's akin to that.
It's an analogy to that.
Yes, it's akin to that. And but I'm not saying to do that. I'm just saying we need to be careful about how we change definitions. And sometimes changing a definition isn't the right approach. Sometimes it's defining the entity that we want to accomplish something is the right approach.
And then the follow-up to that is it also going back to my theoretical analogy where I get eminent domain powers.
Sure.
And I had a guy who had a 600-acre ranch. I don't take the whole thing. I just put in a 150-foot easement or a right of passage.
Right. It would depend on the situation. I mean, you would never take the whole thing.
Okay.
Absolutely right. It would be the right of way for the project. You know, typically, I mean, and you could take it in fee, but typically, I mean, the idea is an easement. I mean, there's no reason to have it in fee if an easement. I mean, again, I would have to do some research. It's been years since we've used eminent domain on a project, so it's a nightmare to deal with. I mean, it's not good for the company. It's not good for the local the property owner for sure. It's not good for the community. I mean, it puts a lot of people on different sides of the position. It's not a good thing to do.
Is it also, one last if you might, is it also your understanding that under the eminent domain statute, if I am going to condemn an individual's property and take over. And it's their principal residence under the Constitution that I believe they get 1.5 times the market value.
I honestly don't have an answer. I could get you an answer that I could ask our attorneys who deal in that area a little more and get you a definitive answer on
Okay.
that.
If I am correct, which I'm often not, if it is 1.5 times the market value by law, you'd have a competitive reason not to want to use eminent domain if you could get it for cheaper, right?
No, I mean, there are times we have definitely paid more than 1.5 or 2 times market value because, again, for us in the long term, eminent domain's not a positive thing to be used. I mean, we're going to be in an
Thank
area
you very
for long.
much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gross, your answer to Representative LaFave's question seemed to contradict your earlier testimony that, you could willy-nilly use eminent domain under this legislation, but as you just said, you'd have to have a purpose for doing that. Is that correct?
Sure. So, yeah, I'll try and see if I can harmonize those for you. There are some requirements on eminent domain procedures, and some of it is practice and history that we've been involved in and kind of knowing the community and having to deal with some things, and there are some restrictions. That being said, eminent domain is a powerful tool, and you can use it fairly quickly if you choose to. I think most people who are responsible with eminent domain rights really extend the process and try not to use that, and I think that is reflective in most entities that are in the state of Michigan, and quite frankly, around the country. There are developers out there now, and I'll give you an example of one, and it's a company called Clean Line, where that's not their approach. They go in and they jump to eminent domain. They just ratchet through, and they can get to an eminent domain proceeding fairly quickly, and they go through, and they will couch it as we're building a line, and we need this property, and we're using federal rights as backstop. I mean, they go fairly quickly down that process.
I guess what I thought I was hearing from you before was that they would, by definition, get the eminent domain. They wouldn't even have to have a project. They could have a hypothetical project, and then they would just go in and start clearing the way for that hypothetical project, but that wouldn't be the case because they would have to have a reason for taking the land under the current law.
That's some of the debate, and this is where my point back to I don't think there's some clarity in this. I mean, if you look at the definition in Act 30, which is what everybody keeps pushing back to, this new definition, it would say that it is proposing to engage. Proposing to engage is much different than having an approved project. We have a lot of projects that we propose, and
I guess what I'm asking is that proposing to engage and having the authority to use them in a domain is different from actually being able to go in and start taking property.
I don't know. I guess we'll find out if the legislation came through. I mean, I think it would be fairly short ordered until you got a legal case on it.
Representative DeAnda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony today. My question is Michigan in a growth state for energy, or are we in a decline for your company's perspective?
We're in a transition. Can I use that as an option?
Transition up or down?
So different transformation. So look, I mean, there's not a lot of electric growth in Michigan. I don't think that's a secret. I mean, and it's not because the economy's not returning, but we're becoming more efficient. There's a lot of energy efficiency that are going online. You have sectors that are growing. You have the electric sector, electric cars. All of us have a cell phone in our pocket, and maybe 3 or 4 more at home, and tablets and computers. So personal demand is going up, but you also have appliances becoming more efficient. What I say by transition is you've heard there's going to be a massive change in the generation mix. I mean, we're going to go down that path. Federal regulations aren't driving that so much anymore, as much as customer demand and just the market prices of natural gas and renewables and in that aspect. So do we see a huge spike in growth coming up? No. I mean, there'll probably be some, it's probably a slight uptick. We don't see demand going down, but we don't see a 3% growth in energy use every year either.
Just my final question, Mr. Chairman. Also, can you give us an idea about your profit margin for your company on how you're operating right now?
My profit margin. Are you talking about our rate of return? Of what we return on an investment?
Just on investment.
I mean, I don't know our profit margin, I'll be honest with you. I can't give you that. I can tell you what our regulated rate of return is. So we're federally regulated, and our federally regulated rate of return is set by MISO now, and I believe it's 11.39 is what the return on equity is, and then there's a split, and we're getting a lot, I have to get a lot smarter people to answer the full question for you than I can, but there's a split based on what your debt is, what your actual equity is in a project. So, I mean, that's kind of the cap level. It's not in practice that level, because then you're doing these other factors when you're deciding what the final return on your investment is.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So you're saying with all these coal-fired plants being closed down by EPA that there's no scarcity of electricity?
What I'm saying is we believe the grid is very stable.
Thank you. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you said these bills essentially do two things that they couldn't do before, site certification and eminent domain.
Yep.
Just want to clarify, you said you are fine with allowing other companies the ability to have site certification, correct?
Yeah, I think it needs to be crafted in the right way if we're talking about those specific projects, the competitive projects, and that's what I heard testimony to be about, are these competitively big projects at the RTO level. I think there's room to have some discussions there and figure out how to address that hypothetical issue, yes.
Okay. And then my other question, same as before, do these bills give a company like Grid Alliance or LS Power more authority than you guys currently have?
No.
So this is essentially whether or not we want to expand the amount of people that can have, say, these eminent domain power. It's not whether or not they can do something that isn't currently already allowed by ITC to do.
ITC or other utilities, ATC, Wolverine,
right.
consumers.
So, so the concern over eminent domain abuse could already happen. I mean, you guys could do that currently, correct?
True, it could. In fairness, though, I mean, there's a track record here, and I'm not saying that anybody before you today is going to abuse it. I'm saying there are developers who are registered on that developer list who have a track record who have abused it. So you're also letting them in, and we already know that there's a history there with some of those folks.
So would you be open to modifying legislation to restrict eminent domain use or ability by yourself and the new companies coming in?
I don't know. I didn't come here prepared to talk about that, to be honest with you, Representative.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Vice Chair Lisinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So could you please explain the process? So we talked about the siting certificate. There was mention of a construction permit.
Sure.
I'm not sure exactly where that lays in the process. And where is the final authority where we as legislators, via our instrument of the Michigan Public Service Commission, can approve or deny or have final say over whether or not eminent domain is exercised, or is there that right in the process? Could you kind of go over that process
You want me to talk
for
about the current law process? Is that what
Yeah.
you're asking, Representative? So there's no construction permit. I think the reference was supposed to be to the siting certificate.
Okay.
Which is here it's the 4483. It's commonly referred to as an Act 30 certificate. So the process that you would go through is we're going to skip a whole bunch on the front end, and we're going to assume that MISO has approved what's called a baseline reliability project. These are the majority of projects that are built for transmission in the region, in all the RTOs. That's PJM, MISO, SPP, you name it. That's kind of the main projects. These are non-competitively bid projects. So let's assume a project's been approved. Let's make some assumptions here that this project is 345 kV and that it is 10 miles long, so that we know it goes through the Act. So we'll make some assumptions to give you that process. At that point, you have a process, project's been approved. We would then have to go for that project to the Commission, and there's a litany of things you have to do when you're doing an Act 30 as far as public hearings, alternative routes, things along those lines, and the Commission would then pick the best route available. At that point, that would be our identified route after we've done a series of public hearings and worked with the community, and in theory we would start building that transmission line along the approved route that we get in. The approval under an Act 30 does not give us eminent domain rights. That is the Commission's blessing for their route. So they're kind of saying, hey, we agree this project is needed and this is the route that's got to go forward.
That's the Public Service Commission.
The Public Service Commission, I'm sorry, yes. And then the one tool that gives you is in the event that there's a local ordinance, and I'll use the example that maybe you have a municipality that requires everything to be underground. You can then push back on the municipality as a public need to not have to use that local ordinance, and that you could above ground your transmission or above ground whatever that project. So you would start processes of meeting with property owners along the affected route line, reaching out, start negotiations on if this was a greenfield project, so there's not currently any transmission in that space, so there's no easements, acquiring your easement rights, acquiring vegetation rights. People don't always think about that, but it might be, hey, we got to cut your trees back, we have to do this. You go down that process. You would only, the goal would be to negotiate everything through and never have an eminent domain hearing at that point, and sometimes to Representative LaFave's point, you're going to pay more than what would be 1 or 2 times market value for a piece of land because, I mean, quite frankly, when you start figuring in legal costs and everything that goes with it, it still makes more sense to do that, and as being part of the community, you're going to do that. Now, unfortunately, let's say we have something where you had to condemn a piece of property. At that point, you would start condemnation proceedings and you go to the court. The court would then, and I'm going to give you real high level because I'm not an expert in condemnation proceedings at a court, but you would go in and there would be, legal proceedings, there would be multiple appraisals brought in, and a judge would determine 2 things. One, are you going to be able to condemn the property? And 2, if you are going to condemn the property, this is what you're going to pay.
Okay, and so once that gets built, so if you as the utility or transmission company builds it, what happens if you at some point go bankrupt, walk away, don't provide good service and maintenance? What does the landscape look like in terms of changeability or companies building transmissions, walking away? What's the risk there?
Well, I mean, for us, I don't think the risk is there. I mean, I'm not sure how we'd go bankrupt at this point. I'm not
Well, I'm just looking at the definition of a company, of an RTO is pretty...
I guess I'm not following the question, maybe.
Well, I guess I'm just looking at it, if we're looking at expanding this, if what part of the act was when this was put in place was the idea that we were trying to
sure.
obtain transmission to a group of stable companies.
Yes.
If we open this up and we bring in companies who haven't completed any projects, or we bring in companies without track records, if we bring in companies who aren't vested in
right.
the electric grid of our state, what does that look like, or what is the potential?
Sure. So the way transmission works, it's analogized a lot to roads, because you think about your local roads and your highways, right? And those are kind of differentiation between your distribution system, your transmission system. So a lot of people use that analogy. So, and the one big difference people don't always put together when they make that analogy is, you do a competitively bid for a highway project and it's bid out, and then the state owns that and is responsible for maintaining that. In this case, whoever builds the project is the owner and responsible for maintenance of the project. So if ITC builds the project, it's our responsibility. We have all the maintenance responsibility. We have the operational responsibility. Our operational facilities in Novi. We run the grid for the state out of Novi. We run all our grids actually out of Novi. So that's our job to take care of that. I can't speak to how a developer would handle that, an outside entity who's not in the area, who doesn't have the same workforce. I mean, that would be a business decision they would have to make, and the state doesn't have any oversight over that piece. So if they may say that we're not worried about it, it'll be fine, or they may try and negotiate a deal, or they may operate it independently of our system. I mean, there's a lot of ways. Now, MISO is the overseer of the whole thing, so they're still coordinating, but think of MISO kind of as your big air traffic controller, and then you still have your states that are running the local planes. You got your Lansing airport, but you still got your Detroit Metro that's kind of coordinating the region aspect. So there's the differentiation. They're not looking at all levels of lines. They're looking at large, big lines. So I can't give you an answer as to what would happen if a line went bankrupt, if a company went bankrupt that had a line. I mean, Arguably, if it was in Michigan, we would see if it's a line worth purchasing, but it could be somebody else would purchase it. It could be go into liquidation to pay off creditors. I don't know what the result would be. It would be an unknown response.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Halleck.
So if you go in front of MISO with a bid, do they have to give the bid to the lowest bidder, or do they look at circumstances about how financially they're structured? Can they do the job? Is the bid so low that there's no way that they can compete or they can complete it?
So MISO has scoring criteria for bids, and again, I'm happy to get you a more detailed explanation of the bidding process. We can do that, and we have folks who are involved with that. So I'll give you my high-level understanding is, the short answer is I don't think lowest cost means win. It's best bid, okay? Maybe that'll be low cost, maybe it won't. So I think they look at things such as operational track record. I don't know if financial wherewithal or those type of things are looked at, to be honest with you. They obviously look at costs. I think they look at design. There's a whole bunch of scoring criteria that goes that a lot of smart people are part of, engineers and accountants and all that go through and address that issue. But the short answer is low cost is not the sole driver, and that's pretty consistent, I think, on all the RTOs. So for instance, in PJM, when they do bidding, cost isn't a factor at all. That's not what you're bidding on. You're bidding on design, and then you get to recover your costs. So in that case, PJM will say, here's our problem, design a fix. It wouldn't surprise me if at some point MISO and others move towards that. I mean, that's the more established model that's out there. And in that case, it's not the lowest cost project that wins. It's what they deem to be the best design wins. And then because transmission is federally regulated, it is you get to recover, your rates and costs and that go into this process. Some companies have put in cost caps on their bidding in the past on some projects. Some have not. It varies greatly across the industry. We haven't seen whether cost caps are going to be tested or not. We'll point that out. Maybe they work, maybe they don't. We don't know yet. I mean, there could be a situation where you win a bid and you have a cost cap, but the real operational costs, you put a cost cap of $15 million on this project, but the real operational cost cap is 20. So is the cost cap really enforceable, or can they go to FERC and say, hey, we were off on this, and to your point, Representative Lisinski, if we can't recover the costs on this project, we're going to abandon, this will be abandoned plant and process, we won't finish this project. We can't recover the costs and we can't operate it at a $5 million loss. Hasn't happened yet. I don't know if it'll happen. It's unclear, and some of this is just, look, it's a new world as far as the competitive process, and there's going to be some growing pains and some learning curve to that.
Mr. Gross, do you contend that the legislation as written would allow somebody to exercise eminent domain without getting the approval of the Public Service Commission?
I don't know. I don't think it's as clear as it could be, is what I would say. I think there is the ability to tighten that up, and again, I think, maybe the look, and we're happy to sit down and talk with you or the sponsor on this, is to define the term we're trying to get at, and we want to have access to this so that we make sure, one, that it's tightened and that the commission is having its oversight role, so that you're not having some unintended consequence where an entity that the commission wouldn't be comfortable with or the legislature wouldn't be comfortable with comes in and has these rights.
Representative Elder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Gross.
Good morning.
Question is, does ITC have any projects in states where ITC does not operate as a utility?
So, yeah. Well, we're building a project in Pennsylvania where we're not a utility. It's called a merchant line. It's a completely different style of project. Basically, that project will run from Erie, Pennsylvania to Ontario under the lake. And it will be paid for by the users of that line, so it doesn't go into rate base. It's a non-traditional approach. We have assets. We are now a utility in Kansas, but when we started in Kansas, we were not, and we partnered with local units, local cooperatives and municipalities to jointly build a line and create some joint ventures in those cases. And then we look at projects too. I mean, we have, we're no different than any of the other companies out there where we look and see where there's opportunity. If there's going to be a competitively bid project, we bid on projects too. I mean, that's no secret. So, but right now, most of our projects are all in entities where we have utility status of some sort. So, I mean, we're a unique entity in the world of transmission, and that we've never been owned by a generating company. We have no stake in generation. It's, we're a little segregated in that sense. So we still work through some of this, and sometimes we struggle to get people to define what we are. We would just say we're a utility. It's just we're a utility without generation or distribution. But I don't know if that answers your question or not, or if it's a long-winded way to get there.
Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your clarifying testimony. And I'm hopeful that the two sides are not too far apart on this, and we can kind of get some satisfactory language that would satisfy some of your concerns. I feel that the eminent domain question is kind of what everybody keeps coming back to, and I think to your point, how eminent domain provides kind of a backstop, I think it brings the sides together a little bit. So in a sense, having that eminent domain capability has, in some respects, I think to your own point, prevented it from actually being utilized. So both sides know that that's the fallback option, and neither side really wants that to happen. So I think it kind of brings them to the table to reach a satisfactory resolution that both parties could agree to, because the alternative for both is less or is worse than that option. But didn't know if you had any thoughts on that. I guess
I think that's I think that's true historically in Michigan.
Sure.
I think that's probably true for other companies. I can't speak to their approach necessarily, other than what I've seen. I mean, again, I can get you the art. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you that company that you pointed out that I guess you said would be kind of abuses the rights of eminent domain. Are their state eminent domain statutes less restrictive than we have here in Michigan? Like, do our property owners have better protections in Michigan?
Well, quite frankly, in some cases they were opened up to pretty much anybody that wanted to come in and use them and couch themselves as a utility.
I just mean on the actual takings part of it.
I would have to look on that piece of it, to be honest with you. I can't give you a direct connection.
Okay.
I could get you more information on Iowa. We have some impact in Iowa, and we've been involved in some of those proceedings in Iowa, what's happening there.
Sure.
That's been one of the issues that we've monitored more closely, because we have assets in Iowa.
Sure. I'd just be curious if our laws in Michigan are already more protective for individuals, and if they're abusing something in Iowa that wouldn't really replicate itself in Michigan because we have different property rights or something. Thank you.
Representative Johnson, I would ask you, Representative Johnson and Randy, to be as brief as you can. We have one more person that would like to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep it very short. Not to beat a dead horse here, but I just want to clarify. You stated that you think this legislation might allow someone to exercise eminent domain without approval of the MPSC. You also stated that this bill doesn't give them any more authority that you guys currently have. So are you guys currently allowed to take land without approval of the MPSC?
Sure. I'm going to answer it very clearly. The Commission does not oversee eminent domain. Eminent domain is a statute. There's rules that are set there. If there's a condemnation proceeding, it's done through the courts. What the way the language is drafted right now, so there's a universe of entities that have that right currently in the state. Current law, there's a universe of entities. It's typically your utilities, water utilities, us, regular traditional electric, natural gas, things along those lines have those rights. What this does is now expand those rights farther out to a whole new set of entities that did not have them before.
And who could not exercise it without the approval of the courts?
Well, all condemnation, yeah, I mean, it's a takings. I mean, it's a constitutional right. It's a takings. It's going to go to court because you have to be compensated.
This person proposing a project, Boogeyman, couldn't actually exercise eminent domain without the approval of the courts, just like you and everybody else that has that authority now.
Absolutely. All condemnation proceedings go through courts. But, the court's pretty deferent. I mean, I'll be honest with you, the courts are pretty deferent give a lot of deference to condemnation hearings. I mean, it usually comes down, they're settling the value, not the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Gross, for your testimony. We have Brad Williams not wishing to testify. He's with the Detroit Regional Chamber, and he opposes the bill as written. And we have, don't have a name here, but I have Indiana Michigan Power. Someone within Indiana Michigan Power does wish to testify, is neutral, and says they'll take 1 minute. And then there might be questions. Your name, sir, for the record.
Brian, for the record. Excuse me. With Indiana Michigan Power, I've been on the job for 5 or 6 weeks, so I'm actually newer to the job than you all are to the energy debate. So I will take a very brief amount of time. I just want to point out that Indiana Michigan Power, if you haven't heard of it, I know Representative Griffin is aware of it, located in the very southwest corner of the state of Michigan, serves about 125,000 customers in Michigan. But for purposes of these pieces of legislation, is part of a larger family of companies known as American Electric Power Company. AEP is the nation's largest transmission system. They own the largest transmission system in the nation, more than 40,000 miles of transmission. That includes more 600 kV voltage than all other U.S. transmission systems combined. I&M has, as you would suspect, a couple of affiliated companies within the AEP family that could be impacted by this legislation. As written, we think they might be deterred from constructing transmission projects in Michigan, but we support the goal of the legislation, as the chairman has pointed out and as the sponsor has pointed out, which is to give equal opportunity to everyone competing for transmission projects in the future. We simply want to make sure that our affiliate companies are on the same and equal footing to compete for those projects. To do that, we think will require some technical refinement to some of the definitions. We've had some productive conversations so far with Ellis Power. We invite ITC to have conversations with them as well. Certainly our view, consistent with what Representative Johnson's questions and a number of other questions have been, that aside from the small projects that the previous speaker talked about, which are less than 5 miles, less than 345 kV, those projects can be done without getting a certificate of public necessity and convenience, but larger projects require that. And we think the right-of-way, the eminent domain flows with that project and is limited to that project, and certainly we'd be open to talk about that. Simply appreciate the opportunity to testify today. To keep it short, want to let you know that we are open to continued conversations. And again, simply want to make sure that our affiliated companies within the AEP family have an equal opportunity to bid on future projects in the state of Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien, for your testimony. I believe I heard every witness today say that they were supportive of the objective of the legislation, and the only question being concerns about the way it's currently drafted. Members of the committee, I'm open to having a vote on this at our next meeting next Tuesday if the votes are there. So I would encourage all parties, since they've all said they do not oppose the objective of the legislation, to get together quickly. Let's put a deadline on it. If the votes are there, I'm prepared to accept the motion next week for its passage. So hopefully we can arrive at language that will meet everybody's approval in language, not just in intent. With that, need a motion to excuse any absent members? Vice Chair Lisinski so moves. Without objection, so ordered. The House Energy Policy Committee is adjourned.